Hello, everybody. This is Brian Colby with the Missouri Budget Project. I am the policy director for the Missouri Budget Project. And I have with me our consultant for governmental affairs, Jeremy LaFavor.
Hi, thanks for joining us today.
Today, we're gonna be talking about the budgetary process and where to find information about the budget, where to go, where to look, and how to track your funding, your line items that you care about as the budget process kind of moves during the year, and where to find historical data and other things that you need. So to start off, we'll start off just with some general information. Some of this may be redundant to some of you that have heard this before. Others, this may be new information. But the budget is broken down really in three parts. There's a state dedicated revenue, that's earmarked funds. Sometimes we talk about them. We have federal revenue and a state general revenue. And the general revenue portion of the budget is what the legislators have some control over. It's what we track most closely, and is what where we see the changes. The other parts are dedicated funds. They really can't be manipulated by the legislative process or by the legislature, and so but they make up about a third of the budget. But we'll really be talking mainly about general revenue. This next slide shows the, where the general revenue budget gets its money, where the revenue sources are. And as you can see, the largest part of the GR budget is made up of income tax. About 70% of GR is made up of the income tax. The next largest section, 23%, is sales tax. And then a smaller portion coming from corporate tax and other. Um, of all of the sources of state generated revenue, um, it's a little bit of a different picture. Here we see um, um, individual income tax really only making up 37% of the budget. Other funds making up a big section, 42%, and then sales tax coming in, making up the rest of it.
And the reason I think these two slides together are so important, I'm going to go back one real quick and show that this is general revenue, and so that's of course the part that Brian talked about was the stuff that the legislature can adjust. Now, what happens is a lot of people jump to that large blue portion of the graph and say, "Wow, our state is super reliant on our income tax because of GR." Well, it's in Missouri. It's a little bit different to compare that state by state because when you look at the next slide, this is all sources of state generated revenue, not just the stuff that the legislature gets to move around and sort of play with. In other states, they don't have the other categories. Here, I'll move. I think I don't know if people can see the mouse movement over here, but the large maroon category oftentimes is considered part of that GR revenue source. And so when you consider all sources of state generated revenue, not just the things that are available for the GR budget, our state is about in line with other states in terms of the amount of revenue we generate from our income tax. And so sometimes you'll hear people talk about Missouri's over reliance on income tax. And again, that's because they're looking only at this slide and the 70% income tax. But when you really take in all sources of state generated revenue, it's more in line with that. And so that's something that we want to highlight a lot this year, and we want to talk about this year because as we talk about adjustments to our tax structure, there is likely to be some additional emphasis on the individual income tax rate. And so we just want to make sure that we're showing the most accurate picture of where the state really gets its revenue.
And as you can see in this slide, that the other is made up of the dedicated taxes, tobacco tax, motor fuel, other road funds, lottery, and gaming proceeds. They all are derived from Missouri, so they're a state generated tax, but they're dedicated, and so it doesn't appear that when you look at general revenue, that portion that can be manipulated by the legislature, it seems to be a little bit outsized, but it really is in line with other states of having about a third of your revenue, state generated revenue, coming from an individual income tax. Here's a slide that breaks out where the funds go in the budget. As you can see, the biggest slice of the pie is social services, which includes Medicaid, or a largest portion of Medicaid, the Mo Health Net budget. There's also Medicaid dollars in the other portion, mental health and health and senior services. So both of those make up probably the largest segment of the entire budget. Second to that would be elementary and secondary education, and then other slices like transportation, conservation, economic development, and public safety and corrections. This slide looks more at the general revenue budget, that portion that the legislature gets to manipulate. And you see here it's a little bit of a different story, where elementary and secondary education actually make up the biggest slice of that pie, 37%. And then you put another 9% for higher ed. And you see that education actually makes up the bulk of the general revenue budget. And social services, mental health, and health and senior services are the second biggest portion of this. And the reason for that is that the federal government really pays for the bulk of our healthcare spend. And sometimes we'll hear a lot about how Medicaid's crowding out dollars for education and other priorities. And it is true that healthcare spend has been growing greater than other portions of the budget. But with regard to our general revenue budget, it really has been relatively consistent as a percentage of GR for the healthcare spend. Though it's getting bigger, it's really the federal government that's spending more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. It's often said that if you've seen one Medicaid program, you've seen one Medicaid program. They're all different. It's just kind of the same way for state budgets. And not all state budgets are put together the same way, and they don't all use the same language or nomenclature. And in Missouri, we have a few terms that are relatively unique to Missouri, and one of which is the core budget, oftentimes just called core. And this is a name for the monies needed to sustain services based on items in the budget from the previous year. But it also includes the cost increases in those services and projections of increases in demand or utilization of the services. Oftentimes we see that in our Medicaid budget, and depending on how the economy is going, that number can go up and down, but that's what we call the core. And this is how generally all budgets are in Missouri are structured. We have the core budget, and then any other new items or any other cuts are based on what we anticipate the revenue coming into the state will be. And so another term that you will hear is CRE often, and that's Consensus Revenue Estimate. And that's put together by our Department of Revenue and our budget and planning staff in the Office of Administration. And they anticipate where the state's going to be with regard to how much money it's bringing in. They track it on a month-to-month basis. At the Budget Project, we do the same thing. And at the beginning of the year, the beginning of the budget process, they land on a consensus revenue estimate.
And they do that with the leadership in the House and the Senate. And that's why historically or traditionally, and we'll get to the use of that word, but they called it a consensus, is that the House and the Senate and the governor all come together on a number. Again, traditionally, they've come up with a consensus. The last maybe 8, I don't know exactly how many years they haven't come up with a CRE or come up with one that really people agree on. And so it'll be interesting to see how the new governor and his staff, especially with their history working with the legislature, will do that this year. But that's usually a number that's landed on in conjunction with the legislature and the executive.
And so at the beginning of the process, we look at the core budget, and then we look at the CRE, the consensus revenue estimate, and begin the process by saying, can we maintain the core budget and the increases necessary in it with the amount of revenue that's coming in with the CRE? And if the CRE looks like there's going to be more money than is needed to fund the core budget, and then they entertain the idea of having new things added to the budget, and that's called a new decision item, an NDI. And so an NDI would be something that had not previously been in the budget the previous year. It may have been in the budget some years back and taken out, but it would be an increase in a line item or a new line item that would be different from the previous year's budget, and they call that an NDI. And then the last term in our glossary here is traditionally. And as traditionally is defined as a part of a long established custom, practice, or belief. And here I've added, or whatever leadership wants to do at the time. Most of the budget process is based on a traditional way of looking at things, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And those who are in charge of the budget process or the handling of the budget at any point in time during the year has leeway to deal with things in whatever way they would like to, if it's within the bounds of the Constitution. And so an example of that may be that the governor would present his budget at the state of the state. But last year, Governor Greitens decided not to do that. And so traditionally, we see the governor present the budget at the state of the state, but he decided not to do it that last year, and so it wasn't done. And so you'll hear us say traditionally, but keep the caveat that could change. All right, and this just kind of lays out a list of the budget bills. There are actually 19 budget bills, but the first 11 bills are the ones that get the most attention. And you can see here they begin with public debt going through the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education that we call DESE, higher ed, Department of Revenue, Transportation, Office Administration, Agriculture, all the way up to mental health and health and senior services, and then the biggest one being the Department of Social Services. So most of the attention in the budgetary process is focused on these 11 bills, but there are several others that are on our second slide.
And let me just jump in here real quick, Brian. The bills, this is kind of unique to Missouri, and most other states. There are a handful of states that do it like this, but most other places, the bill numbers change from year to year. But in Missouri, every year, these are the bill numbers for these departments. And so when you're looking for, an appropriation and for social services, you can always go to House Bill 11. Now that's a little bit different because the General Assembly runs in 2-year cycles. And so one year it'll be House Bill 11, and next year it'll be House Bill 2011, just because of the way they number bills. But people can regularly expect in Missouri, which is a nice nod to transparency. You can always expect your funding line item to be in basically the same bill every single year, which is a nice way to find stuff. And we'll talk a little bit about sections later on. So um, the section number may change somewhat, but we'll talk about that. But the bill number will always stay the same.
Yeah, and so it's an easy way to track year to year. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the bulk of the time, looking at the budget in the committee's process will be on this House Bills 1 through 11. With the exception of, and this is the other bills that are necessary to fund parts of the budget. They don't necessarily change a whole lot. They don't have a lot of lobby attention paid to them, with the exception of House Bill 14, which is the supplemental funding bill. And what the supplemental does is pays for items in the budget that have gone over budget. Essentially, if they've estimated how much spending there would be, and if there's an overspend or a need to spend more on a certain department or service, that's made up in the supplemental funding bill. And this is oftentimes the very first bill that the budget committees take up in the beginning of the year, and it's just called the supplemental. Sometimes it can be somewhat contentious because it can appear to legislators as the administration spending more money than they were supposed to have spent. Or it will be pointed out that some program, oftentimes Medicaid, is costing more to the state than the legislature really would have preferred. This has and why would something have to be paid for in the supplemental? Why would there be an extra cost in there? Oftentimes, it comes with either the department not anticipating a certain cost, or it could have, as in other years, been that the legislature had not taken the department's recommendation for the cost of a program and lowered that spending authority. Oftentimes in Medicaid, this would happen, and then the bills or the costs come in where the department estimated it, but the legislature had not allowed for that and lowered that appropriation. And so sometimes it can be somewhat contentious. In the last few years, it has been, but generally, it's a program that or a way of paying for an over spend that wasn't anticipated in the budget.
There's also times when the federal government will make funds available in the middle of a state fiscal year that the legislature didn't anticipate in the previous year. And so because federal funding has to go through the appropriations process, they will appropriate it through the supplemental. And so sometimes we've seen that through some child care funding. I think we may see some child care funding again, supplemental request again this year. But there's a handful of things that do that.
Excellent. Thanks.
Let me go back. Sorry, one, as I was looking at that. The other bills, not every year do they come up. Each time, a lot of times there will be a capital improvements bill, but not every year that there is. And so, and the budget project hasn't spent a ton of time historically or traditionally. Of course, leadership could change. Looking at those, but sometimes they are an item for discussion, and sometimes they're not. This next year, I'm not certain that I haven't heard any discussion about whether they will or won't yet.
So they call it the budget process for a reason. It really very much is a process. And traditionally, historically, it goes in a certain way, and it begins in the with the department's request, and that generally or traditionally comes out first week of October, and that's when the departments will make public their departmental request, which is based on what they believe is necessary to maintain the core budget, and sometimes will include new programs that have been developed at the departmental level, and they will provide those put together with the Office of Administration and their Division of Budget and Planning, and they will consolidate all of those and make those public. This year it was October 1st that they were made public, and traditionally somewhere in the first uh, of the first weeks of October. But the process actually begins a little bit earlier than that. And I point this out because if you have an interest in lobbying and trying to get a new line item, or if you want to make sure you want to maintain your line item, there really is an opportunity before the budgetary process begins officially and the legislative process begins, is that you can go to the departments and begin the discussion of either having a new decision item or maintaining the core program that you're involved in. And you can start that actually over the summer, because as soon as the legislature kind of finishes the process, the departments begin picking that ball up in the summertime and looking at where their spending is, looking at with consensus revenue, anticipating what's going to be needed for their budget request from next year. And that actually begins in the summer. And so really your opportunity to engage at least with the departments and maybe the governor's office or individual champions actually begins as soon as the legislature quits in May. So keep that in mind. But that's the first step in the process, is the department recommendations. They're given to the governor. The governor picks up the ball at that point in time and adds any new programs that the administration may be interested. And he or she in the governor's office may want to make changes. They may have new decision items, and that will be come in the form of the governor's recommended budget. And then it passes from the governor to the House. The House deals with it, then to the Senate, conference committee, and to the governor's desk.
And just on the governor's side, again, traditionally, the House Budget Chairman introduces the governor's recommended budget. But we saw under Governor Nixon that didn't happen all the time. My guess is the next budget chairman is likely to go ahead and introduce Governor Parsons' recommended budget, and so they actually will take their recommendations and put them in their system, and that's how they'll take that. And my guess is it'll happen that way this year as well.
Yeah, and so again, the word traditionally comes up. Traditionally, this is how it goes. It kind of comes from the departments to the governor, to the House, to the Senate, to conference committee, the governor's desk. And we'll get a little bit more in depth on this slide. And there's a lot on it and a lot to read. But this kind of maps out in a calendar process where things are at any point in time. And so, as we mentioned, over the summer through October, to October, the departments are putting together what they want to request in the Office of Administration and their Office of Budget Planning, and the governor kind of put together those recommendations. Then the governor releases his executive budget. Oftentimes it's at the end of January, but he has to release an executive budget by February 2nd. And then the legislature actually picks up the process. And here you can see in the House, and by January, the chairman of the budget committee introduces the budget bills, and oftentimes they begin with the governor's recommendation, and then they make their changes as they go through the process. We have House appropriations committees. They're kind of subcommittees to the budget. We'll talk about that in a minute. And they make recommendations to the full committee. And then hopefully, oftentimes, traditionally, I should say, before spring break, the House kind of finishes up its process and hands it over to Senate Appropriations Committee, which traditionally will be meeting, and they're traditionally looking at the governor's recommendations but they oftentimes wait for the House's version of the budget bills that move over to the Senate side and then take those up and make changes to those bills. There have been years where the Senate simply didn't wait for the House. They took up the governor's recommendations in full. There's oftentimes the Senate and the House will fight, and there's a difference in the way that this procedure moves through. But traditionally, this is kind of how the calendar works.
Yeah.
So the budget process begins and is overseen by the Office of Administration and its division of budget and planning. And it is headed by the budget director, who the current budget director is now Dan Hogg. And that's a picture of Dan there, very tall gentleman. It's been involved in this process for years on many sides of the aisle. Worked in staffing the legislature, and he's just been around the process forever. And sitting next to him was the previous budget director, Linda Lubring.
And I think it's important to note that while these people are, the directors of the entire state budget and they have great, big, important jobs, I have historically found them to be exceptionally approachable people, particularly for folks in the advocacy community. When I first came into Jefferson City working for Partnership for Children, I spent a lot of time in Linda's office as the budget director and would simply go to her office in the first floor on the guard shack side of the building. So, I mean, truly go down there if you're available and try to set up a meeting with. And Dan, I have found to be the exact same way. He is extremely approachable and friendly and knowledgeable about histories of programs and why things have been the way they are or are explained the way they are. And so I recommend to every advocate, nonprofit individual to use both of these really fantastic human beings as great resources because they're very approachable people. Again, their offices are on the first floor of the Capitol, guard shack side. Tell them Jeremy sent you.
So we're kind of going back to the department recommendations. And so each department is required to present a recommendation that will state what they believe that they need. And depending on the department, depending on the way that the departments function, the way that they're funded, the departments have to make kind of an assessment of their needs based on a couple different things. It can be based on a formula, like DESE is, and that's the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And they'll make an estimation of how many students they're going to have, what funds are available, what the formula dictates. As many of you know, we fully funded the formula last year for the first time in a bunch of years. I don't know how many. And that was because they provided a little bit more money, but that's also because they changed the formula slightly to make it a little bit easier to do. So either you're funding on the basis of a formula or you're funding on the base of trend data. And that's what they do with the Medicaid program. And trend data is the information of what they're seeing with regard to claims, utilization, and cost. And they come in as a trend. They track it pretty much on a monthly basis. CMS utilizes the same. That's the Center on Medicaid and Medicare Services at the federal level. And they're watching these claims coming in, the cost of the program, and the number of enrollees, and trying to project how much money they will need to maintain the program in the coming year. Most of the recommendations are based, though, on the previous year's budget or core. And there's that word again, core budget. And so for the most part, the departments are operating from the previous year core and building out from there. So back to the word traditionally. And we talked about this earlier. Traditionally, the governor presents his budget. He takes the recommendations of the departments, makes the changes that he wants and then presents that at the State of the State, which is early in January, and it kind of marks the beginning of the legislative process. And so then we move on to the legislative process. And in the House, that process begins with subcommittees. And traditionally, these subcommittees are tasked with looking at the bills that fall under their general purview. They provide recommendations, and they are sent up to the larger budget committee. And traditionally, the chairs of the subcommittees committee, but they're the ones that get the first crack at it.
And the vice chairs usually sit on the budget committee as well, as do the ranking members. And again, in order to sit on the full budget committee, usually or traditionally a member needs to sit on one of the subcommittees. Again, it kind of depends on the committee chairman whether they fully adopt the recommendations of their subcommittees, because the subcommittees, and it depends on, of course, the rule structure, and those tend to change depending on the speaker. And I don't know if Elijah is going to change a whole lot. I would assume probably not, because I think Scott probably likes the way things are going right now. And Scott is the budget chairman, Scott Fitzpatrick from Shell Knob. And so my guess is Scott will give his subcommittee chairs some leeway to change appropriations and make changes to the budget and recommendations, and then head to the full budget committee. But truly, once the budget hits the full budget committee, the chairman has the ability to adopt the subcommittee recommendations or not adopt the subcommittee recommendations. And I think Chairman Flanagan, prior to Fitzpatrick, usually did not adopt the subcommittee recommendations, which was unfortunate because a lot of people spend a lot of time looking at the budgets during that time. And so it'll be interesting to see how Scott continues to handle this process, and how much weight the subcommittees have in the full process.
So traditionally, this is the way it's done. They introduce the budget bills on the floor and send them off to the subcommittees on appropriations in the House. They take up the bills that are assigned to them and go through them, and then send them on to the budget committee, the larger budget committee. So it's a good opportunity to begin your process of advocating by identifying who the chairs of these committees are, the vice chairs of these committees, and the ranking members for the minority, and start advocating at that level, because traditionally their recommendations are looked on as important to the entire budget committee. There have been years that they hadn't, but that's where you can start. So start by looking at the chairs, vice chairs, and members of these subcommittees. And then after it goes through the subcommittee process, it then goes to the House Budget Committee. Traditionally, it's pretty large. Last year, it was a very big committee. And they're the ones that really drive the process of creating the budget that will be looked at seriously by the Senate traditionally. And the person in charge of that, as Jeremy mentioned, has been Representative Fitzpatrick, Chairman Fitzpatrick. And he is looked at, being the budget chairman, is looked at as almost in the same way as holding a statewide office. So by tradition, he not only represents his district, but because he is the budget chair, and the same in the Senate, the Senate Appropriations Chair, they really have a responsibility to respond to everybody in the state. And so they're looked at almost as a statewide office holder, and should be at least responsive to all members of the legislature, and then everyone in the state, because they hold this position. And so if you do not live in Senator Fitzpatrick's district, and you're not a citizen of Shell Knob, Missouri, it doesn't mean that you can't go and ask for a meeting with him, visit with his staff and himself, and make sure that he is aware of your priority.
And I've also found him and his staff to be exceptionally approachable for everybody. And there have been budget chairs that I've worked with in the past that have not been that open. And so again, I would encourage folks to use his staff. Chris Dunn is his, I think he's the chief of staff, but he's the boss in the office, and so Chris is helpful, and he's been around the budget a very long time, so he's also very informative.
Yeah, Chris Dunn. The budget chair gets a little bit of extra staff than another representative would have, and Chris is extremely knowledgeable about the budget, open and a good person to work with, and has a great deal of responsibility and carries a lot of responsibility, especially early on in the process. And so, reaching out to the budget chair staff, Chris Dunn is currently in that position, is a great contact to make. And so the House Budget Committee, so he is chaired of the committee, runs the process. The committee starts with the recommendations of the subcommittees. The Budget Committee will hear from the department directors. This is a very long process. It's a very time-consuming process. All the members of the House Budget Committee spend a lot of time working on the House Budget Committee. And the gentleman to my immediate right, Jeremy LaFavor, who's on with us today, was on that committee. He can testify personally about how much time the committee takes up or takes going through the process. It's very important. Jeremy was always very eager. He sat in the front row.
That was because I was a Democrat.
Yeah. Minority member of freshman member of the minority. So they sit closest to the front, and the chairman sits all the way in the back with the ranking and the vice.
They can throw things at us.
so luckily for those who are watching the process, and thankfully they now put that online, so they stream the budget committee hearings online. You can find that on the General Assembly website. Go to the House and their budget page and click that button, and you can watch those hearings, so you don't have to physically actually be there. But there are times that you probably want to and should be. And so they'll hear from the department directors, they'll hear the recommendations, the departments will have to explain why they recommended certain things, especially if they have a new decision item, something that's new, they'll have to explain and make their case. It's very informative. You always learn a lot from that process. In
addition to being critical that folks are there on markup day, it's also, I think, really important to have somebody there, or if you can't be there yourself, during the department directors, because that's when lawmakers will ask some questions, and if there's a question that somebody seems uneasy about a program or something, you want to get somebody in to talk to that lawmaker sooner rather than later and let that thing grow, because of course the next step is markup, and you don't want to come to markup and have a lawmaker have your program be a target where they're trying to take money away from them. So it's important to be there during that justification period, whether you may testify or not, but it's critical that folks are there on markup day.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point that Jeremy makes. If your line item is in House Bill 11, you may not want to sit through House Bill 7's corrections department presentation, but you want to be there or have somebody listening when your line item comes up in whatever bill that line item may be in. And you'll be able to pick up a lot, and especially if you find some legislator that is critical of your program, doesn't understand it properly, if it's represented incorrectly. This is your chance to find that out and then go to them and plead your case and make sure that there's a better understanding of what your program does, how it fits in the budget and should stay in the budget. So we talk about markup, and that's the term that they use for the amendment process. So the bills are introduced based on the governor's recommendation. They go through the appropriations committees, and if there's recommended changes, or if the budget chair or members of the budget committee want to make amendments to that budget, maybe add a new decision item in there, or decrease an appropriation. That's called markup. And this process is very interesting, and it's an important thing to understand. In the House, it is necessary if you want to increase an appropriation, have an increasing amendment, say a new spend or increase a line item through an amendment process. You also have to, at the same time, provide a decreasing amendment. And this is critical in the process because um, they will identify some other line item in the budget as the decreasing amendment. And this is where line items become vulnerable. And if you've done your work advocating and you're there physically looking at the committee as they propose an increasing amendment that may be decreasing your line item, it's important for you to be there, important for you to be seen. It's kind of like, if you're not at the table, you're on the table type of thing. This is a real important part to make sure that your line item is safe. And once they go through that process and finish the markup, as it's called, then they vote on all of the budget bills and then send them to the floor of the House.
And that markup usually takes a day. And what they'll do is they'll come in the morning and bring the committee in, and then they'll release the markup sheets. And those will, representatives will have to have filed their amendments with the committee the day prior, and then the next day, that morning, everybody will get a sheet, and you'll see every amendment that's going to be offered that day, all the ups and the downs. And then they'll head to the floor for a little bit, and then they'll come back down to the basement for the House committee room, and then they'll just start going through the bills. Generally two. One is debt, and everybody pays their debts. So they'll start 2 through 11, and it'll go sometimes quickly. But I've sat on markup committees that went until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning before. But they'll generally knock that out in a day. And so it's a big long day.
And it's part of the process. If you get our newsletters, we're kind of updating when this is going to be as much as we can. There's a lot more items that are placed online by the budget committee, so the process is becoming more and more transparent. We try to get this information out to our friends and members and folks as this process is going through. But that markup process is extremely important. Can be a very long day, but that's when amendments can be made. And then it goes to the floor, voted out of the budget, goes to the floor. And this in the House is the last chance to add something to the budget. And so amendments can be made on the floor. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm paying attention here. So then after the House votes out the budget bills, then they go over to the Senate side. And Senate Appropriations has probably already started its hearings. They've heard from the departments. They've looked at the governor's recommendations, but the process begins in earnest when they get the budget bills. But again, traditionally, that is the process. There have been years when they've just simply taken up the governor's recommendation and ignored the House. There's been a year once, I remember, where for whatever reason the Speaker of the House ignored the House Budget Committee's recommendations and just sent over the governor's recommendations. But for the most part, the Senate is eagerly waiting for the House bills, the budget bills that have been amended and changed by the House, and then they take those up and begin making whatever changes that they see necessary. And the interesting thing in the Senate, the two real interesting things that are different than the House side, is that in the Senate, if a senator on the committee would like to have an increasing amendment, they would like to add something to the budget that's not originally there that would be different. There is not a need to have a decreasing amendment. So the senators give themselves a little more leeway. And so you can have an increasing amendment, not to have a decreasing amendment. So you can make a change and not have to make a change somewhere else to the other part of the budget. So if you do not make your line item in the House budget, you have a chance to make that change in the Senate. If it was cut from the House, you have a chance to get it reinstated by the Senate. And so this part of the process is very important. And if you're following a line item, you have a program in the budget that you want funded, there's still a chance to get that funded on the Senate side. Generally, they receive the budget bills right before spring break or not too far after. And then they kind of begin the process in earnest. And it used to be the tradition in the Senate that they were a deliberative body that worked in consensus. And the appropriations chair would do hard work to make sure that all the members of the Senate Appropriations Committee were in agreement. And there was general agreement among the senators in total. And that when the budget would leave the Senate Appropriations Committee, it would not traditionally be amended on the floor. But that said, that tradition has not held in the last couple of years, and there have been amendments offered. And that speaks a little bit to the rancor among different senators and a little bit of a breakdown in the decorum of the Senate. But traditions used to state that the bills wouldn't be amended on the floor. So if you need to get a bill your line item into a bill or support your line item or whatever, that process of getting that done in the appropriations committee is really critical. You really need to get it done by then, or you're going to be running out of chances.
Mm-hmm.
Conference committee. Every year, or most every year, the Senate and House budget bills will not be the same. They will be different in some version, but to make their way all the way to the governor's desk, they will have to reconcile those differences, and that is done in conference committee. And some people joke that the state capitol is a two-party system, not Democrats and Republicans, but rather Senate versus House. And there have been years when this was pretty contentious. The House and the Senate budget chairs would publicly go to battle during conference committee to try to see who could make their positions on the budget final. And there's been other years where the process has been a little more congenial. And but it is where the two different versions of the budget get reconciled. And they do that by agreeing to the House side or the Senate side, whatever change was made. And there's really not an opportunity to add to the budget during this process.
They can also land somewhere in between. So, say the House has got $500,000, Senate's got $2 million. They could settle on anywhere in between one and whatever. I mean, they could settle anywhere in between. But I think the next point about exceeding the differences means any amount that is greater than or less than an amount in the conference committee is not allowed. And so the legislature or the conference committee, if the House has got $500,000 and the Senate has $2 million, they can't eliminate the program, but they also can't fund it at $5 million. They could technically, if both chambers, the House and the Senate, brought a motion back to the floor, then both chambers voted to allow their conferees, the conference committee members, to exceed the differences. The leadership in both chambers would only allow that to happen under a really extraordinary circumstance where there was some sort of technical or real error in the budget, where, say, something was supposed to be $100 million and it actually read 1 million, they would go ahead and go back and allow them to exceed the differences on that. But it's important to know that you can't get above and beyond, and you certainly can't add any new items once you're already there.
Yeah, so critical to your ability to impact the process. If the budget bills have gone out of the Senate and they're in conference committee and your line item's not in there, you're out of luck. And you're not going to get it added in the conference committee. So get your work done before the bills get out of the Senate. All right, then we go on to the governor's desk, and the governor can sign the bills, veto the bills, line item veto the bills, sign the bills, and then withhold the money. Which I think you understand signing the bills. You can understand vetoing the bills. It's pretty rare that a governor would veto a budget bill in total. Mm-hmm. He can, she can, if there is some major philosophical issue at which he wants to hold the legislature's feet to the fire.
Managed care,
something like
really
that.
Opposed to that, veto the entire budget and say, come back in a special session and do it again. But
pretty rare that it happens. Pretty rare if the governor and the legislature are of the same party.
Yeah.
But it could happen. But what happens more likely is that they veto line items of the budget. And that would restrict the department's ability to spend that line item. But what happened probably more often and probably more significantly is that the governor would sign the bills, but then during the process of looking how much revenue is coming in through the year and whether there's going to be a budget shortfall, he can withhold the money from the department and say that they cannot spend to the amount that has been appropriated by the legislature. And I think it's probably important to say here that the legislature probably, it's kind of debated, but they essentially put an upper limit on appropriation, right? It's the administration that can spend up to that amount.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But they really don't have to spend that amount.
Yeah.
Now, it gets contentious when they don't, because the legislature and the budget chair believes that they have the power of the purse and they are directing the department to spend that much money, but they don't have to spend up to that appropriation, and they can withhold. So let's talk about if the governor were to veto. If there were a veto, the legislature has the power to override the governor's veto. That happens during veto session, which occurs about the second week in September.
Yep.
And so if the governor were to line item veto something and the legislature disagreed with that, they could override the governor's veto during veto session. But it's important to know they can't add anything into the budget that was not passed in the budget bills at this time. So don't think that you can get your line item funded during the veto session if it wasn't included in the approved budget bills. And this is a good looking slide that for some reason is formatted strangely. But this is what we're talking about. I don't know. We'll have to fix the slide, folks. But we're talking about withholds. And so if the administration, the budget, the director, Department of Revenue, see not enough money coming in, there's some type of budget shortfall, we have a downturn in the economy or something like that, and we're not going to be able to have the funds to fund fully the budget as passed, the governor has the ability to withhold that funding until that shortfall is dealt with. Now, 2014, sorry about that, folks. In 2014, they passed Amendment 10 that allows the legislature to go back and kind of override a governor's withhold. That has not actually taken place. The process by which that would take place is not clear, but it just means that nothing is completely finished with regard to the budget because of Amendment 10, because if the governor were to withhold, the legislature could come back to override that withhold, but they haven't done that, and the process for doing that is not clear, though they have the ability to do it. So, show me the money. You want to get a line item in the budget. You want to figure out how. The first thing you need to do, the first two things you need to do is find a champion and find the money. Find somebody in the House and somebody in the Senate, preferably in the majority party. But if you can't do that, majority members can offer new items in the budget. But find a champion, make sure they know what the program is that you're hoping to fund, why you're funding it, and then if you can find the money, then provide that answer to them as well. And where would you find the money? Savings in a program that you see occurring, so the departments don't have to spend to the level they're appropriated. If consensus revenue estimates are being exceeded by actual revenues, so if the CRE was too low and we see more money coming in, you can identify funds that way. But it's helpful if you do find a sponsor and they have an answer of where we're going to get the money. You provide them that answer, and look at savings, look at changes in federal spending, look at changes in revenue, and during the year we try to point that out through our newsletters and other things that we do. All right, where to find the data? Department budget recommendations, as we talked about, come out in the first weeks of October. This year was October 1st. They are online, and you can see the URL where you can find these. They're on the website of the Office of Administration under the Division of Budget and Planning, and that's where you find the budget books. And we'll talk a little bit more about the budget books and how helpful they are. Then the governor will also put out his executive budget, and in that he'll have kind of a narrative for what he would like to do a little bit differently than previously, where his priorities may lie. And then, of course, the House budget bills, which don't have as much information about specific items in the budget, but they do have the line items in the previous year line item, whether or not it's a new decision item. And you can first find those budget bills on the House website under their budget committee link. And they'll have links to all of the budget bills, as will the Office of Administration and the Division of Budget and Planning will have, and we'll show you where they are.
And the reason the Senate doesn't have much on their website is because the bills are always House bills. Yeah. And so that's just the Missouri legislature hasn't figured out how to get the House and the Senate to exist on the same virtual platform. And so their connectivity is limited. So you'll have to, even when the House bills are in the Senate and it's a Senate process, you can go to the House website to track the bills through the Senate.
Yeah, and that's the best way, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But in the departmental budget request, they put out the budget recommendations, and we call those the budget books. Sometimes they're called the black books, and they used to be printed, but they really don't print them anymore. They're online, and that's where you find them. Now, members of the budget committees will receive printed copies. You can print the copies, but they don't hand them out in that way anymore like they used to, which saves a lot of trees, trust me. But in the budget books, you find a whole lot of information that is not just what the line item is. And you find a lot of information about what the program is intended to do, what's its strategic priority, how does the program measure, what metrics does it use? It measures the program's activity, its quality, the impact and effectiveness, the actual expenditures from previous years. 3 years are listed, the current year projected spending. You also find out the sources of other funds There may be a dedicated fund. There may be a contribution coming from, say the lottery or something like that, that would be described in the budget bills. You also see where the authorization of the program comes from. Is it a federal statute or a state statute? So if you believe that the legislature is not treating this line item in the way that it was intended, you can go back to that statute and you find out what statute it is in the budget book, and then go back and see if they're following the rules of the law as it was intended. You also find out if they're federal matching funds, how they're structured, and an explanation of those, and whether or not, if the program is federally mandated, does the state have to do this? And again, the legislature may have a different opinion. You can find out in the budget books if this is a federal mandate, and go explain to the legislature that may disagree with your program, saying, "Hey, we got to do this because we'd be out of compliance with the feds, and they could withhold federal funds and otherwise sanction the state if we don't do it in the way that it was intended." And so there's a whole bunch of information in these budget books, real important to find. How do we find these appropriations? It's kind of done in this way. The budget book will have a section number. The first part of that section number will be the budget bill number. So here we have budget bill 11. And then it has, after the decimal point, the section of that budget bill that has the specific line item in it. And so to track these, locate the appropriation in the bill and the budget book, then find your section number, and that's where you're going to get the information.
And from year to year, I think I mentioned this earlier, the bill number is going to stay the same. I mean, there's, occasions where states will move parents as teachers from DESE to social services or back, or, silly things like that. But largely, you're going to stay in the same bill number. The section number, the line item stays generally in the same area. But those section numbers can change from year to year. Sometimes that's because of NDIs, those new decision items, and then sometimes it's because something was taken out of a budget. But so if you're looking for in-home services or childcare, and last year it was 11.378, head back to 11.378, and if it's not right there, maybe check up or check down a little bit, and you should be able to